Welcome to the Mockingcast, the podcast of Mockingbird Ministries. I'm David Zoll, your host, and in a few moments, I'll be joined by my co-hosts, Sarah Condon and RJ Heyman. We come to you every other week to discuss a few of the places where we currently see grace and its absence playing out in unexpected and compelling ways. We're glad to have you with us.
Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. God.
Hi, you two. It's been a minute here.
Yo.
I'm so happy to see your smiling faces on the little computer screen. What is new? We haven't really didn't do really much of a check-in last time. Any updates from Condon Land or Heyman World? What do you have to say?
Well, I just got back from a college retreat this weekend, so I'm exhausted, but really eager to paint my entire house now, because after I climbed up on what was a 12 to 15 foot ladder to paint 20-foot ceilings, I kind of feel like I could go into this professionally. So one of my students was like, "Are you scared to be up there?" And I was like, "Drunk people do this all the time. Like, I can do it."
Well, Sarah sent us a picture of herself on a ladder that was like twice as tall as what you thought it was going to be. It's 20-foot ceilings. That makes sense. And you guys did not pick a neutral tone, from what I could tell. The church didn't.
No, we were painting it.
Chartreuse?
No. It was yellow, and we're painting over the yellow.
Oh, okay.
To clarify, yes. Because it was just like very jarring when you walked in.
Apparently studies have been done that you think yellow is like a cheery color, but it actually just makes people angry.
And it's the children's ministry room.
But everyone survived one piece, Sarah?
Everyone, oh my gosh, they had so much fun. It was a blast. It really was. And nothing will make you realize more that you're like almost 40 than like going to the beach with young people, because they just like put on their swimsuits and run out there, and you're just like, "Hi, I need a giant hat, a t-shirt, like comfortable shorts," like. Anyway, it was really fun. RJ, I sent you guys a picture, and RJ was like, "It took me a minute to figure out that you weren't like a college boy, like in the photo." And I said that to my husband, and he goes, "Actually, yeah, me too."
Okay, good. I felt a little bad sending that, but I'm glad.
No, Josh was like, "Yeah, I couldn't find you in the picture either." Then I saw like, basically a college boy with a t-shirt on that said "church lady," and I was like, "Oh, there's my wife." So.
I could see where RJ was coming from, because it all blended together from afar. Right.
Look, I'm not there to be glamorous, okay?
Well, Rutger, what do you have to say?
We just had spring break. My wife took my middle son on a week-long tour of basically every single college and university in the state of Texas. Because he's dying to get back to Texas, having spent his youth there, and they had a great time. Yeah. I was home taking care of my 5-year-old, and then Jonathan Adams and his family came in to visit, which was great, except I ended up staying up way too late, and then my son got me up too early, so I promptly got sick this week. So I've been battling a cold, but I think after like 4 or 5 days, I'm finally on the mend. But generally, things are great here. Weather is beautiful, and family is pretty happy, and church is good. And,
just another week slumming it in Palm Beach.
Just slumming it in Palm Beach is what I do.
Now, I'll just say, we're doing well here in Charlottesville. Thank you guys, as always.
Dave. Good. How are you?
Did I ask?
How are you,
I'm not sure I asked. But.
Virginia is holding strong. It's nice to see. Honestly, it's nice seeing people come back to church. You can never tell when the switch flips, but it is switched here. And I don't know. I'm sure of all the lessons, and we'll still be untangling this for years to come. But just locally, something happened where people are kind of living their lives again, which is nice. Which it took. When I tell people that we were still doing certain precautions, like in other parts of the country, they're like, "What?" It's been like years since we've been doing that, and I think, well, this is so locally specific in lots of different ways, and lots of the pressures people feel, certainly. So anyway, doing well here. I woke up to news that Will Smith had struck Chris Rock at the Oscars.
I did
not watch the Oscars.
Wow.
I sort of abandoned the Oscars. but I did see the movie that Will Smith was in. You know where he's amazing as Richard Williams.
King Richard. He was
King
pretty
Richard.
good.
I thought he was incredible, but I also know that he
Yeah.
really did not look like it was staged. It looked like he really.
Yeah, it was
him.
legit.
I mean, it is someone who's dealt with that because that's part. He made a joke about Jada Pinkett Smith's hair loss, and it's like it's such.
She has alopecia, right?
Yeah, and a
Yeah.
husband like watching a wife go through that is such. It's really hard. I mean, women who struggle with that are like we're on higher. Higher prescriptions for antidepressants, like across the board. Like it's crazy how much it impacts just your sense of self. And to watch his wife go through that and to see someone on television make fun of her, like I was like, yeah, that's fair.
Anyway, that's happened, and we had to explain that to my son this morning, but that was sort of exciting. But I wanted to...
I'm glad that Coda won. I gotta say.
I haven't seen Coda.
And I saw it. It was good. And like, I actually, for the first time in probably, 5 or 10 years, I actually saw every single Best Picture nominee.
Oh my gosh, RJ.
And I was
that's
just
so
really
cool.
hoping personally that Power of the Dog or Nightmare Alley wasn't going to win because they were so deeply nihilistic. I was like, can we just have a
Weren't
movie?
they?
Like, I watched both those movies.
I'm so glad to hear you say
Yeah,
that.
I
'cause
watched
Power
both
of the
those
Dog,
movies.
I saw that and I was like, oh.
And I was like, well, that's 3 hours of my life I'm never getting back. You know, it's like,
Yeah.
okay, beautifully acted, beautifully written, beautifully directed. Like, oh my gosh, I need a drink. You know, like, ugh.
I know.
You know,
Yeah,
whereas at
yeah,
least the
yeah.
other movies were there was a little more redemption. Praise God.
Did you? Okay, totally cut this. I know we don't have a lot of time, but I just have to say one interesting thing I learned because I listened to an interview of the director of Nightmare Alley,
Guillermo del Toro.
Guillermo del Toro, who's
Thank
amazing.
you. So the guy who originally wrote the book Nightmare Alley was married to C.S. Lewis's wife.
What?
And they were all friends.
Whoa.
And they even after she left her husband, so they got divorced, the guy who wrote Nightmare Alley, I can't remember his name, she marries C.S. Lewis, and they still, like, he and C.S. Lewis still corresponded.
Wow.
Isn't that fascinating? Anyway, I was like, what an interesting, like a C.S. Lewis connection with Nightmare Alley. So
That's so interesting. I really haven't
Christian.
seen... the show I'm watching right now, which I think is just brilliant, is Severance. I don't know if you guys have been watching Severance.
Yeah.
RJ sort of told me
We've
on
watched some of that.
pulled me onto it, but like
Yeah,
the talk about the moral quandaries and
I can't watch it. I think it's just too much for me right now. Josh is.
it
really
might
it's too
ultimately end
much
up being
for me.
extremely nihilistic, but there's lots of I think relevant questions in the age of technology and work-life balance and just who am I is a very interesting show. I commend it to people. I mean, maybe the final episode will air and I'll say that was terrible, but
Well, the other thought, I always think it's interesting to look at the sort of movies for a given year and think about collectively the messages that there are, what they say about where our culture is right now. And I remember there was a piece I saw somewhere, it was entitled something like Hollywood is done with the nuclear family. But then I thought about this year's Best Picture nominees, and I actually thought, especially when it comes to father figures, there were some incredibly good father figures, like King Richard, Dune had an amazing father figure, and Coda, like all had amazing father figures and kind of amazing families, and I found that to be a little bit hopeful as well.
my
cut that out, but for
my
what it's
favorite
worth.
movie that I saw this year was Licorice Pizza.
Yeah,
and
amazing. Agreed.
I thought there was a lot of redemption in that, and it's beautiful. But then just love and adolescence. And Philip Seymour Hoffman's son is just so great.
I had no idea till my son told me yesterday. It's Philip Seymour Hoffman's son. Talk about redemption.
But I also
that.
really loved Dune, and I'm told that Belfast is incredibly moving.
Belfast is
I'm-
really good, and another good
I wanna
father,
see that,
another
so-
good father,
yeah,
another amazing family.
yeah.
I think we're yearning for some good.
That's Stephen Colbert's like all time. Like
That's the one he
every
talked
time I feel like
about.
every time he talks about Belfast. I'm like, I have to see it. This guy's like my spiritual guru.
Let's talk about watching movies on the couch in Goblin mode. Do you guys know what Goblin mode is?
I don't know what it is,
No.
but I feel like I'm
I was
in
gonna
it right
say,
now
exactly.
with
I
I
my
was like, over
bathrobe
to
and my
our local
uncombed
Goblin
hair.
expert, Sarah Condon. What do you have to say? Wearing your
Wearing her hoodie.
I mean, I just got the kids off to school. Like, you guys are an hour ahead of me. I cannot help it that you're both like in real clothes.
Why are so many people going Goblin mode? Writes Carrie Paul in The Guardian. At some point in the stretch of days between the start of the pandemic's third year and the feared launch of World War III, a new phrase entered the zeitgeist, a mysterious harbinger of an age to come. People were going Goblin mode. The term embraces the comforts of depravity. Spending the day in bed watching 90 Day Fiancé on mute while scrolling endlessly through social media, pouring the end of a bag of
Check.
chips in your mouth, downing Eggo toaster oven waffles with hot sauce over the sink because you can't be bothered to put them on a plate. Goblin mode is not a permanent identity, but a frame of mind. Goblin mode is kind of the opposite of trying to better yourself, says Juniper, who declined to share her last name. I think...
Oh, Juniper, God bless.
She's really going Goblin mode. I think that's the kind of energy that we're giving going into 2022. Everyone's just kind of wild and insane right now. The trend represents a direct departure from the hyper-curated cottagecore influence of early pandemic days, a standout trend of 2020 that included,
Who comes up with this
included
stuff?
pastel colors, bucolic scenery, and the showcasing of wholesome homemaking skills such as baking and embroidery. Cottagecore thrived under the wistful ethos of making the best of what many people assumed would be only a few boring weeks at home in 2020. Call it a vibe shift or a logical progression into nihilism after years of pandemic-induced disappointment, but Goblin mode may be here to stay. And why shouldn't it? Who are we trying to impress anyway? As one Goblin mode audio says, if you can't handle me in Goblin mode, you don't deserve me at my sleigh. It is cool to be a goblin, one person says. Everyone is so perfect all the time online. It is good to get in touch with the strange little creature that lives inside you. Is it? Yes. Is it? You know, I think Goblin mode seems to be linked to also being by yourself. And how is it? Are you able to go Goblin mode if you have little humans to, take care of? I don't know, but I do know the allure.
Or do you just embrace that life is Goblin mode when you have little humans and you're like, I can't be bothered to clean the living room, and we're just going to use paper plates and have, fried freezer food.
Well,
forever.
I describe
Right.
Goblin mode as like if you guys, to use a Seinfeld reference, it's sort of the embracing of sweatpants in all areas of one's life. Like
Yes.
to throw out any kind of pretense about aesthetic, refinement. Just like I'm going to go the easiest possible route in every single area of my life for a little while to not put forth any effort beyond mere survival. I think it's a funny phrase. I think Goblin mode is one of these sort of video game type words or analogies where you sort of just I'm gonna cut back all of the unnecessary systems operating in my person and expend no extra energy. But do you see this? Have you heard this word? What do you think about it, Sarah?
Oh gosh. I mean, for me, it just sounds like grief. So, sorry. It just sounds
That's
like,
what I actually thought, Sarah, when I read it. I was like, it sounds like...
Yeah. It sounds like grief, like fresh grief, like where you just can't do anything and you can't get off the couch and you're like in the same like bathrobe and nightgown for like days on end and like you're scrolling and it makes you feel worse and you can't get out of the cycle. And like, this kind of sounds miserable to me. I mean, as someone who's like really profoundly been in that mode, like I'm so grateful to be out of it. And so, and for a while I was like, and I'm sure I talked about here, I would be in this stage where it was like, I'd kind of rise out of it and I'd be like, maybe this is it. And then I'd go back into it, and now I'm not, now I don't wake up every day afraid I will slip there. Yeah. Right. Like I'm through enough grief at this point, but, yeah, I just think like anyone who is like not on an antidepressant or anxiety medication in this year of our Lord 2022, like I just like don't know how you're that much of a superhero. Like I'm just like, that's amazing to me. It's just like that's living on the edge. Like that's wild to me. You know what I mean? That you're doing that. So yeah, or you like. or you desperately need it. You know, like it's just yeah, this is really bleak to me, to be honest with you. It's hard for me to find the humor in it, I think. I don't know. RJ, make it funny.
Okay. Yes, ma'am. I kind of went goblin mode this weekend a little bit because I was sick, you know.
Yeah.
I hated it, but
Yeah.
I was in bed and I did it was a beautiful, perfect day outside, like so beautiful on Saturday. But I definitely like pulled the curtains and I wasn't feeling well. And I watched, I watched Nightmare Alley, which was blah. But there was sort of nothing else to do, you know, because I just didn't feel good. And my wife was like, go to the room and don't come out. Don't infect us with your funk, you know. But I'm not kidding when I say that this feels a little bit like something written by people who don't have children, you know, and like there's something about when you have children, especially young children, where you start giving up on a whole lot of things that previously mattered to you, and that's not necessarily goblin mode. That's just kind of like reality mode, or deciding which hill is worth dying on mode, or something. I mean, the other thing which occurred to me, having just preached on the prodigal son yesterday, is prodigal son was living goblin mode. You know, big time. And
I love it.
You know, and we had that amazing Rembrandt painting, The Return of the Prodigal Son, on the cover of our bulletin, which hangs in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. And the son looks like a goblin on his knees.
Wow.
You know, he's one of his shoes has no sole on it, and he has no hair on his head. You know, talk about Jada Pinkett Smith. But his father is loving and embracing him. And so the thing that the interviewee said about if you can't love me, goblin mode, I thought, was that Slay, S-L-A-Y or S-L-E-I-G-H? Okay, Slay.
It's not
I'm so old.
Santa's sleigh. No.
RJ,
I'm so old.
You're so straight.
That was so chuggy what I just did or something. I don't know what that was. But
Took me a sec. You're right.
Yeah, anyway. But I resonate with that, right? We do... I often say to couples that I'm counseling for pre-marriage stuff, you know, the beauty and the horror of marriage is that it's what we want most and fear most, right? Being actually seen for who we actually are. And yet the miracle is that we're with this person who sees us at our best and our worst and still says, I choose you, I love you, I want you. And that actually, you know, that kind of vulnerability creates intimacy.
Yeah.
You know, we want to hide, and yet when we can go goblin mode with each other and still love each other, it's a beautiful thing.
I think it could be a useful way of talking about this is me letting it all hang out, kind of like I don't have the wherewithal to project anything better right now, and yet at the same, I mean, I think the thing I like about goblin mode is that it does deflate it a little bit in a sense of like, this is just a temporary thing. I'm kind of laughing because this is me at my absolute worst. Like, it's not the be all end all. It is something that's just gonna go through. There's also maybe something a little bit like goblin mode. To me, the only way it's differentiated from grief is that there's like almost like a gleeful self-indulgence that's not like, this is my only choice. This is just sort of like, I'm gonna eat as much Ben and Jerry's as I want, and that's just gonna be how it's gonna be. And there is sometimes some limited relief to be found. What Paul Walker was saying, that he was preaching about the prodigal son this past weekend, and he was saying that like we all, even though most people who come to church tend to be more sort of quote unquote elder brother types, and acknowledging that we're all of these people, he did say that like everyone sort of wants spring break sometimes, you know, and to cut loose. And for him, it's like to listen to the Doors sing "Break On Through to the Other Side," and just wanted to break on through the other side. And he said, of course, life teaches you that there's actually not that much on the other side. And the goblin mode probably teaches you the same thing. So I thought it was an interesting, like, new cultural word for talking about you at your unguarded, self-indulgent worst, that we could talk about. You know, I did like that line about if you can't love me goblin mode, then you don't take out the word deserve. Well, then you sort of, you don't actually love me. And yet, if you're with somebody, if you're married to someone who goes into goblin mode all the time, you know that you kind of suffer that. Someone's got to put clothes on the kids. It's not we can let ourselves off the hook for so long, and then life catches up to you.
Yeah.
But it's sort of along those lines, because I don't know if goblin mode is synonymous with rest. I really don't think it is. But Peter Severson wrote something for our site, a wonderful thing called "The Gift of Leisure to a Hustling World." Now, this is a young man who's out in Denver and has just gone on a sabbatical. He's not clergy, but he works for a church-related organization, Lutheran one, I think, and he's gone on sabbatical. And he said it surprised.
He hasn't stopped working.
He says
yet.
It surprised people that I wasn't required to do anything in particular while I was away. In short, I didn't have to keep hustling during my time off. Instead, the church instructed me to lean completely, fully, marvelously into the possibility of rest and restoration, which sabbatical offered. In a way, stepping outside work for 3 months, long enough to truly radically disconnect, was intended to remind me that I am a person apart from my job title or the work I do. It might be one of the most grace-filled gifts I've ever received. He goes on to say, Jesus invites all of us, especially those who are addicted to the flurry and worry, to find true rest in him. To be sure, even a sabbatical is a poor earthly substitute for this kind of rest, but it can reflect some dimensions of Christ's invitation. Amid our cultural worship of hustle, rest is a reminder that God has called us, claimed us, and received us beyond any self-justification which our job would claim to offer. Amid the cultural obsession with outcomes and achievements and repeated admonishments to, quote, do the work, rest reminds us that Christ has done the work already, freed us by accomplishing the one thing that truly matters. And amid our cultural addiction to endless novelty, rest reminds us that God's boundless love flourishes in the deepening of our relationships with others, including those who are most familiar and beloved to us. I know one person on this podcast who is about to go on a sabbatical. What does she think?
It's funny. All I can think about is so I was at Trinity Galveston with my students this weekend, which is a fabulous church. Jimmy Abbott's the rector there. He's great. If you live in Galveston, it's a great church. But they have this famous story of the founding rector. RJ, do you know the story?
No.
He'd been there 30 years. Okay. Super gifted person, obviously. He's in the pulpit preaching. And this is I want to say the 1830s, maybe, somewhere in there. Anyway, he's in the pulpit preaching, and he holds out his hand and he says, friends, I can feel the cold hand of death approaching. And he dies in the pulpit.
What?
Whoa.
Yeah, he dies in the pulpit. Yeah. And I remember thinking, I wonder if he got a sabbatical. I was just
he got his heavenly sabbatical.
He founds the church. He he gives his life to the church. Obviously, he's literally in a crypt, like Jimmy showed us, under the church. It's pretty wild, and it's just him down there, as it should be. But anyway, it's so. Gosh, this will sound. I don't know how this will sound, but I was looking at some of the plaques of other people who had served and when they died versus when they probably retired. And, I start to think how much time did they have that their identity wasn't completely rooted in this job? I don't know. I think that's I know we have a lot more than just clergy that listen, but I think that's such an easy trap for us to fall into, where our entire identity, even within our family structure, but our spiritual identity, our relationship with Jesus is somehow bound up, right, in the in church growth or in success in the church, which is on some level a thing of God and on some level deeply worldly. So yeah, I think rest. And I say this to my students all the time. I think rest is a very rebellious act now, right? I think rest and real joy are incredly rebellious.
Remember the nap
acts.
Ministry that we talked about?
Yes.
And I don't think that's I don't think that's going goblin mode and collapsing into self-indulgence. I think it's more.
I don't think. Yeah, I think it's actual like stepping away. And I think that's so important. I wish everyone could get a sabbatical. I am like in any job. I'm really grateful clergy can, because I think it's so important for us to pull back and be reminded of our rootedness in Jesus. I think that makes us better clergy. I think that makes us better pastors to our people, but I certainly think it's healthier for us. So, yeah, I'm super excited to have a sabbatical and take some rest.
There was another article this week Carolyn Chen wrote. She's I think a sociologist, perhaps, out in California. She wrote a book called Work, Pray, Code, talking about how work has become such a religion, seculosity, especially among people in tech startups. Everyone talking about it as their vocation and their calling, and that there is no me apart from my job in that. That more and more, in fact, what you're seeing in the world of seculosity, or what she talks about, is that more and more professions are consciously taking on a sort of a clergy type view or theological view, or the existentially, grafted view of work, in such an extent that I hope that actually sabbaticals become common practice in a lot of other professions. And I think people always think it's such a privilege of a white collar job, and I think, well, most of the clergy I know certainly don't make much money. Like, it's not I don't know if it's necessarily impossible for other type of industries to get along with this, but even if it isn't, it's still necessary for those who are interfacing with people nonstop.
Yeah.
Well,
it's kind of like the nap ministry. It's like, right, like this idea that only privileged people should have this is like totally the wrong way to look at it. Or only privileged people like get this. It's like, no, everyone should actually have this. It isn't that privileged people shouldn't have it. It's
everyone
like that everyone
should
have it, right?
RJ, what do you think?
I think it's really hard for some people, and without being too stereotypically sexist, usually men, to not find their self-worth in what they do, and that's just that's stating the obvious. But I guess I want to have a little bit.
No, but you should say it.
I want to have some compassion on that, and probably that's me wanting to have a little bit of compassion on myself as well. But I remember I've got a good friend who lives in Houston, and he's a really successful guy, very hardworking. And just talking with him about this, and he said, "Look, this is the way that some people are wired. Some guys are wired, and he was wired that way. He's like, look, either I'm all in or I'm not. Like, I can't work 70%. I can't work 80%. I'm either 100% or I'm not." And so he did have something of a sabbatical. He was coming out of one job, and, he had been successful enough that he had the resources to like sort of take a year off. But he also took his family to Africa for a couple months, and he trained for an Ironman, and he rode his bike like 100 miles a day. And because that's just how he was wired. He couldn't, he didn't know any other speed. And at the same time, I do remember also, there was a season of my ministry, maybe 8-9 years ago, where I remember in rapid succession, there were a number of older gentlemen who they kind of retired, and they either like almost immediately had heart attacks or became alcoholics. Yeah. And they didn't know how to deal with it. And let's face it, that's also a thing like in music, right? I've heard what's the lead singer of Aerosmith's
Steven Tyler?
I'm not an Aerosmith fan.
Steven Tyler?
Steven Tyler. But he talked about how, when you're used to having the high of being on stage in front of 50,000 people, when your brain is wired to receive that type of thing, when you don't have it anymore, you've got to replace it in some other way. And usually it's substances, or it's sort of self-destructive behavior, or even the last thing I'll say is the last church I served, there was a large AA group that met on, I think it was Thursday mornings, or I can't remember what day it was. But I remember the parking lot just being filled with all of these really high-end sports cars. Yeah. All these recovering alcoholics who were incredibly successful because they just had, there was something in them that needed to feed, this need, and they were either going to fill it with alcohol or they were going to fill it with sort of workaholism. And like, sorry, and working too much is probably a better option than, drinking yourself to death. So it's not healthy necessarily, but I also want to have some compassion on people who are just wired that way to work all the time and to find their identity
I can
in
say
their
I
work.
took a sabbatical a couple years ago, and it was deeply disorienting for the first week or two.
Yeah.
And then,
Right.
That's a good word.
but then I loved it. You know, it was like, it was, my wife was like, I don't think you're capable of taking a sabbatical. All these like mythologies we have about ourselves. And like, there is a little bit to like, when you say some guys are just wired this way, perhaps, you know, like that's also makes me sad when I hear that, because I hear something, I'm just a really stubborn person. You know, it's like, there is a sense in which like, I thought I was wired one way and I got to take a sabbatical, and all of a sudden, yes, you fill your day up with stuff, but there are better ways to live than working 120. Like, I mean, so I guess I do want to convey, yes, the compassion to people who have a really hard time resting. And I think there are different modes of rest. I think like things like exercise can be deeply restful, in fact. Rest does not look the same for everyone. But I also know that the equating one's output with one's vitality is a very dangerous thing. And I've watched actually, and not just men, I've watched clergy who are sort of have the big job and then they retire immediately, and that's really not great for them. And I've watched them sort of, people take then like our wonderful friend and board member Jim Monroe sort of go from a big job to sort of being an assistant somewhere and sort of just not slowing down, not stopping all at once, but sort of slowing down. And I think that's a really good thing to do. I guess.
Yeah.
I love that. You're like, actually, it's like slowing down your heart rate, right? Like you don't like, you really don't like run and then stop, right? That's not, you know, the thing I keep thinking about is my mom's favorite photograph of my dad, and she had it up in her office. They were with their dear friends who they were on their way to see when they died, Rick and Randy. And, it was these, you know, it's like my parents would get with Rick and Randy, and it was like the one time they could slow down and really that my dad could rest, because my dad was, you know, he was a self-employed writer, which when you say that out loud, you're like, how did he support our family?
That means he worked
but he
that
did,
hard,
and
probably.
he had his own. Yeah, he worked nonstop. I mean, when I think about, so when I was in the house as we were packing things up, the thing that was the hardest for me to look at, I feel like this would be so painful for my dad to hear, but was in his office, because I could see the computer screen and I could see his chair, and I just expected to see the back of his head there, because that's, you know, that's always where dad was. But anyway, there's this photograph of him, and, you know, my dad didn't drink at all, child of an alcoholic, didn't even take communion wine, right? So there were no pictures of my dad like sitting at a table with a glass of wine, like laughing, but he's laying down in the grass on a hill. And it's, you know, and he's like laughing, and he has like a Sprite in his hand. And it's, you know, my mom, I remember she showed the picture to me. Like, it was taken in the past 10 years. And she was just like, this is my favorite picture of your dad. I've never seen him looking so relaxed.
Yeah.
So I also think there's something to be said for like spouses, like being, I'm just going to say, there's something to be said for women being able to see their husbands like, relax, you know, like because we worry, and like getting to see them like actually, you know, like there's something really beautiful about it. I think there's something that reminds us of our first years of marriage, right? When we're able to see each other without all of the burdens, just for a moment.
Yeah,
you know,
I like the what. Sorry,
it was fun.
Continue, Harj.
It was funny this weekend because, like I said, I was in bed most of the weekend, and I.
Sick goblin mode.
Yeah, at some point I apologized to Jamie. I was like, Jamie, I'm so sorry that I've been so out of it. And she's like, oh yeah, it's been a real struggle to stay at home and take it easy, as opposed to like going on some adventure and try to find parking and deal with obnoxious people, you know? Because like my wife's idea of vacation is at this point, it hasn't always been this way, but this stage in her life is like, it doesn't matter where I am. I just want to be somewhere where I can like needlepoint and float in a pool and like read a magazine. Whereas my idea of vacation, as you guys know, is
Jumping
like
off a cliff.
I got to go snorkeling. I got to jump off a cliff. I got to go find a waterfall, you know? And at some point you're like, RJ, I can't take this anymore. I need to just relax. You go do your fun thing. You know, we'll connect back later. So, Dave, for you to say that it doesn't, you know, just lying around, that's not necessarily synonymous with rest. Different people have different visions of rest.
Yeah.
And I can rest, but I also need to have a little adventure. I think adventure is restful for me.
Adventure is restful for you. You know, but I do like the acknowledgement of like, let's deal with who we actually are rather than who we should be. And that applies to our relationship with rest and work. I love the but I love the theology because Peter ends it by saying like God's rest is given to anxious, hyperactive people just as much as those who can chill. You know, it's like it's not premised on our ability to rest best. You know. But this is next from the New Yorker. Becca Rothfield wrote an article called "The Shaming Industrial Complex." And the tagline was, in the online era, shaming is a national...
AKA the church.
Shaming is a national pastime, and yet shameless conduct persists. She profiles 2 books, actually, that have been written about shame and its role it plays, especially online, and how our relationship with shame has changed. But this is what she writes. She says, shame canonically is the sinking sentiment that attends deviation from widely endorsed mores, whatever they happen to be. You can be sad or elated for any reason or for no reason, but shame requires a shared social context. The emotion in question arises not because you violated a standard that you set for yourself, but because you violated a standard that your milieu, perhaps policed by Twitter, imposes on you. One of the authors of the books instructs us to begin acknowledging the cultural contingencies of our emotional outlook and to proceed by modifying our unruly inner lives, eliminating vengeful impulses, and instilling a propensity for shame in the face of moral transgression. So this is one of the authors basically thinks shame can be very good and redemptive as long as it's used to combat sort of bad social codes. But the Rothfeld writes, yet we may wonder how many people are capable of exercising so much control over their feelings. It is usually rash to conflate our espoused ideals with our actual practice. Seneca's vaunted stoicism didn't prevent him from bellyaching when he was exiled. Few will defend vindictiveness for its own sake, but many of us will fall prey to it out of spite. The shame machine's mythologies can be difficult to resist, even for those who are well positioned to know better. For all of one of the writer's rightful skepticism of the weight loss industry, she finds herself susceptible to its stratagems. She returns over and over to the indignities that she has weathered as a chronically overweight woman. Once shame inhabits you, especially from a young age, it's with you for the long haul, she writes. Yet it seems unlikely that shaming the shamers will yield anything approaching justice. Even when shame is employed in the service of virtuous norms, it's bound to spawn excessive cruelties when it is unleashed on a national or even a global scale. Interesting take here on the idea that shame can be something wielded for good. And that and we hear this a lot. Those people should be ashamed of themselves. But she writes about how shame
they're not okay. They're not ashamed.
Well,
for it to be used correctly, you have to inhabit the same ethical universe. Like, so if someone on the right will say that someone on the left needs to be ashamed of themselves, and someone on the left will say that someone on the right needs to be ashamed of themselves, both of them thinking what they think is worth shame is completely different. So it's just talk, you know. But
I mean, just say what you mean and call people idiots. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think that's so much easier and probably like equally as effective.
Relational advice with Sarah Condon.
They're not gonna listen.
Just call them idiots.
They don't care if you're ashamed of them. Just call them an idiot. That's what you think. So see how it goes. Workshop idiot. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I just think shame never gets us anywhere. I mean, we've talked about this, but there's a lot of like the shaming talk that's happening in some pulpits to try to get people back to church. Hell, there was shaming talk before the pandemic about soccer practice on Sunday mornings, right? Like, and it never works. Like, it just doesn't work. So I'm baffled when anyone says anything about shame other than like in a pastoral moment with someone when they said, I feel deep shame about this.
They've come to that on their own, though.
I mean,
it's usually not and it actually is a personal thing.
They've come to that on their own. They've always come to that on their own. Yeah, I feel deep shame about this. And, you know, and I will say I do love this sort of take on like, if you get this in childhood, you have it for life. yes, and get some therapy. You know, like you may feel shame about things from childhood that are not your fault, you know? And I would say even more than therapy, dare to have a conversation with your parents about it as an adult and say, hey, this was really hard. I have this memory of this. I felt deep shame. Walk me through what happened, you know? And maybe your parents will do what a lot of parents do, which is get really defensive. Or maybe they'll be the miracle that was Deborah Ferguson in my life and say, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I remember that.
Yeah.
We didn't handle that well, you know? So, you know, I just
act like shame will be cured at this point by shaming the people who are the shame. Like, I don't think we acknowledge enough that all of the social media, when they talk about the shaming industrial complex, they're talking about Silicon Valley, and it profits off of shame. I mean, the whole model is the more clicks you can whip up a mob to shame someone who's, you know, Will Smith or Chris Rock or whomever it is, and that's going to get a lot of clicks, and it's going to generate a lot more data for the companies that thrive on that stuff. And it's just the truth. That's how these things work. Yeah. And so there's an incentive that's built in that people don't even realize they're being algorithmically manipulated to continue this behavior. And yet I come back to that Colbert thing the other week. It's like, we must not settle for evil as our deliverance from evil. It just doesn't work. Shame is not the deliverance from shame. Like it's, and that's really hard to say, because you want to just say, oh, it's just those Twitter mobs of the woke or the reactionary right wing, you know, everyone, it's their problem. And it's the shaming those, it didn't work with you, and it's not going to work with them, right? I mean, it's. RJ, what do you think, as someone who should be ashamed of himself?
All the time.
Sorry.
Well, check. I think everyone has to deal with their own stuff.
Yeah.
You know, I think about every time someone in the Gospels, someone tries to co-opt Jesus into their own kind of shaming project. Jesus is like, what about you? Forget about them. What about you? He always makes it personal. He's like, don't you worry about those other people over there. They have nothing. What about you? What about me and you right now? Let's do this. You know, and I like that. So yeah, I got my own stuff to deal with.
One of the things that was really cool is this week, actually, Vox is doing a whole series on America's struggle with forgiveness, and there's some amazing stuff about forgiveness. But one of the writers, Aja Romano, wrote an article kind of about this very thing. She says that everyone wants forgiveness, but no one is being forgiven, which starts as kind of yet another rumination on cancel culture. But then it kind of takes a turn. She says this. She writes, social media rewards pithy, angry takes rather than nuanced, balanced discussions, and then boost those takes so they attract more angry, non-nuanced takes. It can feel good to be part of that collective anger, especially when you feel righteous. It's often extremely difficult to let that anger go, to forgive, adjust, and move on. Most moral and spiritual authorities teach us that the cycle of repentance, you know, dealing with bad behavior, usually involves grace. Grace, the act of allowing people room to be human and make mistakes while still loving them and valuing them, might be the holiest, most precious concept of all in this conversation about right and wrong, penance and reform. But it's the one that almost never gets discussed. These people at Vox are not listening to the mocking cast. Grace forces us, this is great, guys. Grace forces us to contend not only with other people's human frailty, but with our own. To remember how good it feels when someone out of the blue treats us with respect, empathy, and kindness in the middle of an angry conversation where we expect nothing but hostility. To be shown the kindness of strangers when we expect cruelty, and then bestow that gift in turn, that's the remarkable quality of grace. It's not fighting shame with more shame. Good. Grace, she basically is saying, interrupts these cycles of these spirals of shame and recrimination. I wasn't kind of expecting to see this in Vox. We don't need to go into that. What do you guys think about? What do you think about grace?
What do I think about grace?
It's everything. It's the whole enchilada. Yeah. What else is there?
What are we doing?
Yes, please.
I'm thinking about this weekend when I was with my students. You know, the weird thing about being a college minister is that like you just say random things, right? Like you're like, wow, this thought, you know, especially if you're me. I mean, that is kind of how I live my life. And then later people will repeat it back to you and you're like, oh, did I say that? I don't know.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
And one of my students was like, he said, you know, one thing you said that like has stayed with me for a long time, and you said it early in your time here, was that no one escapes secular hell. And that was from a piece that we talked about on this podcast. And I guess I preached about it. And I think that's just like, I mean, that's just grace, right? Is this idea that there's no, and I think that's why Vox is probably writing a series and like people are struggling with this stuff, because that's actually what this is about, right? Is that we don't actually have redemption or escape for people through a secular lens. They just are there for forever. And even if they do other things, we're like, oh, they're doing this other thing, but just remember
what they used to do. Yeah.
You know, we have fanny packs, unlike God, and we keep the receipts, and we just want everybody to know they did this. Now they're doing this good thing, but like, remember they did this thing too, right? Because that's how we treat ourselves. Right? That's why God is so radical. That's how we treat ourselves. Like everything we show up for, every time we get praise, we're like, oh, that's good. But like, if you really knew me, or you knew this thing I did, or whatever, like I didn't do all the work, you know, kind of narrative within ourselves, instead of just being loved, which is like very hard for us, right?
Well, we want something that works. We want something that's effective, right? And Capon is so good on this about how grace, or what he calls kind of left-handed power, unconditional love, it's not guaranteed to work, right? It may soften the heart, as he says, it may soften the heart of the person that you are giving it to, but it also may just get your face bashed in, as it did for Jesus. It may get you killed. But he said the one thing it does ensure is that you will never close the interpersonal door from your end between you and another person. You know, you will always keep the door open to that person, even if they shut it on their end, it's always open on your end. And he says that's what God does with us, right? That I love this line, he wedges the dead body of Jesus in the door between himself and humanity, right?
Oh
and
my gosh.
He's like, and he says, there, just try to get me to take that back. You know, you want to know how committed I am to never closing that door? I'm going to put the dead body of my son as a doorstop.
Goodness
sort of
gracious.
between myself and you. Which is a really heavy thing to say.
RJ, that's Capon.
Do you guys not know that?
I've never heard that before.
No, my goodness.
Really? That's like my fave. Oh my gosh,
I
it's
love
so
it.
good. It's so
we got to
good.
put it in the show notes. That's so good.
But it reminds me that I thought probably my favorite movie this year was I Like Drive My Car, not just because it prominently featured a Saab 900 Turbo SPG, which was incredible, and I really want one now.
Dear
But
Santa.
it was all about shame. It was all about shame, and about regret, and about forgiveness, and kind of about grace, but in a really gentle and relational and beautiful way. You know, someone coming to terms with mistakes that he had made and regrets he has, and relationships that have been broken. And
I haven't
really
heard
good.
of this movie actually.
Anyway.
Awesome.
What? Drive My
I
Car?
don't know.
Japanese?
Even I have heard of it.
No.
Okay.
You got to watch it, Dave.
Too busy
It's
watching
really
Severance
good.
over here.
It is 3 hours long, and you'll laugh because the movie starts, you're like, oh, this is a really slow pace, and you're watching it for about an hour, and then an hour in, the opening credits come, and you're like, oh, that was just the prologue.
Gosh.
But it's really good and beautiful,
Wow.
so
Cool.
I commend it to you, especially for the Saab, which, Dave, you used to own a Saab. You had a
Something
9000, did you
always
not?
broken, as they say. That's what. Something always broken.
But so
gosh.
worth it.
It's like a
Something
jet
always,
engine.
always broken.
Yeah. Born from jets.
I have to say this, and I'm sure we said it 8 times on this podcast, but it always makes me think of the line from Jacob Smith that he says about people in your church. They can break up with you, but you can never break up with them.
That's right. That's grace right there.
So
You cannot
That's the
break up
burden.
with them.
That's the
So
burden we
good.
carry. Well, I want to talk about a different type of grace, a sort of almost like divine, or like a very inconvenient and in fact ugly type of grace that some of us experienced. Maybe grace is the wrong word, but Renee DiResta, writing The Atlantic last week, wrote that the Ukraine crisis briefly put America's culture war in perspective. She writes, on February 24th, the invasion began. On American social networks, where the culture war normally rages ceaselessly, the fights that tend to dominate online debate, such as the ones over COVID policies, school curriculums, and trans athletes, suddenly went quiet. This wasn't for lack of effort. Many hyper-partisan influencers tried to keep up their shtick, but the public's attention appeared to be turning elsewhere. Data from CrowdTangle, a tool that tracks users' engagement with Facebook content, suggested that suggested that many of the top posts among American users focused on the horrors and heroism of the conflict. Families splitting up, Ukrainians volunteering to defend their country, a young soldier sacrificing himself to blow up a bridge. Although an imperfect metric, a top 10 list derived from CrowdTangle data, a ranking typically dominated by the most successful political rage content of the moment, suggested that at least for a couple days following the invasion, users were more engrossed in coverage of the breaking war. Those first few days after Russia's invasion revealed something important about the United States. Much of what looks like unbridgeable polarization online may be the product of boredom, distraction, and jadedness. When something real happens, people pay attention to that instead. Now, I know we hear this and you immediately say, well, what are you trivializing here in culture war concerns? Because those are sure important to me. And what I appreciated about it, and there were a lot of jokes about how, Vladimir Putin should be, he solved the COVID crisis in one day because people were just thinking about other things. But I found it to be a very hopeful thing that in the midst of something real, atrocity and sadness and aggression and war, a lot of the little, skirmishes that people feel and the deep, that occupies our online, attention, we were distracted from them, or attention did go to something a little bit more urgent. I remember there's that soundbite that the least racist group demographic on the planet are Trekkies, because they think about the world in terms of aliens and Earthlings rather than in terms of black and white. And there's other things going on there too, but my sense is like the church, one of the reasons I think it's important we talk about death so much is that we properly trivialize some of the things that we think are so important. And we keep in mind the gravity of our predicament, the gravity of mortality, and the real things that could turn at any moment, the lack of control we have. And I saw that the conflict did some of that work, to use the phrase from earlier, for a few minutes. And I saw people who don't have anything else in common sort of find common cause and kind of compassion and an entry point. And I guess that's a breaking in to our closed systems and our filter bubbles. That sometimes it's easy to look at a filter bubble and the degrees to which we're ensconced in these ideological enclaves and think nothing could break through. And that as much as people tried to spin it, it did break through, right?
I mean, I think I didn't know we were capable of it still. I think that's the thought I had, because growing up with grandparents who went through World War II, and people talked about, it was like the rationing of things and the gathering up of old metals to turn into weapons. And, sort of the communal spirit, right? Because the thing with the pandemic was I feel like we had that for a second, and then it got super divided. And part of that was because we were all in our own homes, in our own heads with our own screens, right? And so I remember during sort of the height of pandemic stuff, and certainly there was so much division, it was we're actually not capable of doing anything that my grandparents' generation did. And this has been, and I want to clarify, I do not often, you will never hear me use the phrase restored my faith in humanity. And I do not often look at like the mass sort of movement of my species and think like, hey, look at us. But I was like, oh my God, we're still capable of like collective empathy. We're still capable of like of concern of this other group of people.
Just give us someone else to be mad at. Just give us a common
or
enemy.
a deeper fear,
you know,
like fear of nuclear war, happens to be
Yes.
stronger
Yeah.
and more mobilizing
Yeah.
than fear of a
Yeah.
disease that you may get. You know, it's like,
I mean, yeah. When Jimmy Abbott showed us this, really shaped like a body sort of place where this priest, this founding rector of Trinity Episcopal Galveston is his body is. There are these plaques on the wall, and you get a plaque on the wall when you are a rector and you die. So your ashes aren't there, but you get a plaque on the wall. And so Jimmy's like, there's a couple of rectors before Jimmy, and they don't have their plaques up yet. So he pointed at this empty space to my student, and he goes, this is where my plaque will go. And I said, Jimmy, tell me, when you have a really hard day, do you come down here just to remind yourself that, like, you've got a limited amount of time? And he's like, absolutely, you know, like, so I do think, right, that is the beauty of the church to me as well, Dave, is like, you know, the fact that this isn't the final word, the fact that I know that beautiful photograph of my dad resting pales in comparison to the rest that he has now. Right. I mean, I think there is something though that about Ukraine that's been incredibly moving to me, that everyone has been able to say, we are worried for these people. We see ourselves in these people.
Yeah.
How can we help?
yeah, you're echoing a lot of. I thought to myself, could this happen right now? Like, could we actually come together in this way? And by and large,
Right.
at least for a little while, we did. And you guys kind of experienced that in Harvey, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. Don't you think, RJ?
Yeah, not just Harvey. I thought first, we moved into New York the weekend after the towers fell, like the weekend after 9/11.
Like, I know you've said this before, but that is so wild.
It was wild. And I remember thinking how New York seemed like the night, like the friendliest place I had ever lived. And I still actually do think New York is a pretty friendly place, but there was also something about those weeks and months after 9/11, obviously, where the city really came together and people were interacting with each other and talking with each other and talking about real things and had a generosity of spirit that they probably just didn't have before, And Harvey was exactly the same way.
Yeah.
Like the city had to come together and try to serve these just hundreds of thousands of people who'd been flooded out of their homes. So, yeah, there's something about tragedy that tends to bring people together, and you wish that it didn't take something like that, but it seems to be the case.
Yeah.
It's like just the leaning into suffering to me that is like, I mean, thank God that like we haven't lost that ability in the midst of all our like sort of violent, divisive tendencies.
There was a bit of that here in Charlottesville after the riots in 2017. It got, because it was such a media event, and people saw the discrepancy between how things were being covered versus what it was actually like, right outside my window. It was more short-lived, but I wonder we don't have like an enormous amount of associations with the Ukraine in a way that, frankly, I still do about Russia from Ivan Drago, like from when you're a little kid and Russia was always the enemy. And it has been interesting watching people revert to these, remember Stranger Things, like the third season, it's the Russians are coming to get us. And like, that was my childhood in a lot of ways. And now people are sort of wrapping themselves in those same prejudices, like an old,
which I don't like to see that. I mean, I think, because we forget that there are people in Russia. I mean, they are equally as helpless in so many ways. And I mean, we have a family at the school, and the mom is from Russia, but she's like so many people there. She's like first generation Russian, like everyone's from the Ukraine, and she's got nephews who are fighting in the military, and it's very real. Like this is happening, like, I don't know. And I think I haven't had that sense of, unfortunately, we are so disconnected as Americans from, struggles, fights, wars we've had in the Middle East. And this feels more right
it
in
does.
front of us.
But land
right?
war in Europe. That is the key. I keep hearing that. Let's move on to something that kind of goes a little bit more global, which I was sort of we don't usually go to this macro scale, but David Clay wrote something for Mockingbird I want to close with called "God's Hand in Human History." He says that the ever-present problem of evil makes it hard to speak concretely of a divine plan orchestrating human history, even if Christians have always agreed that such a plan exists. It's better to speak of the hiddenness of God and the unknowability of his ways, apart from special revelation in Jesus and Scripture. Recently, however, even as the world convulses from a global pandemic and a major European war that could potentially turn nuclear, I've started to think that there could be such a thing as excessive theological modesty when it comes to discerning the guiding hand of God in history. Many of the most godly, mature, thoughtful believers in my life seem to have no problems doing so. The hand of God may be somewhat mysterious, but that's not the same as saying it's invisible. Moreover, careful reflection on the way history has unfolded gives us glimpses of God's providence, even as it leaves much of it bewildering and ambiguous. For instance, it is remarkable that humanity made it out of the 20th century alive, once it had invented nuclear weapons. Observe the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, the 1967 solar flare that jammed American radar systems, a possibly drunk Richard Nixon ordering a nuclear bombardment of North Korea after the shoot-down of an American spy plane, the Able Archer exercises in 1983 that sent Soviet leadership into a panic, and post-Cold War, the 1995 Norwegian scientific rocket mishap that literally had Boris Yeltsin reaching for his nuclear briefcase. Given these things, we have to decide between one of two alternatives. One, humanity got really lucky, or two, we were spared. Other aspects of history call for a similarly meta-historical explanation. In her introduction to Christ the Lord out of Egypt, the novelist Anne Rice explained that she had started seriously contemplating the existence of God after studying the history of the Jewish people and considering their survival against all odds to the present day.
Wow.
He closes by saying, in general, it's the path of wisdom to avoid trying to fit this or that historical event into its precise slot in God's plan. Moreover, it's best to hold healthy suspicion towards theological interpretations of historical events that make us and our allies look like heroes and our cultural opponents look like villains. The danger of projecting our own desires and ambitions on God is very real. Even so, God governs in the affairs of men, as Benjamin Franklin once affirmed. To be sure, God does so in a very strange and hidden fashion, but occasionally we can truly see the outskirts of his ways in human history, and we should avail ourselves of these opportunities to find some comfort and give God the glory.
That's so good.
I thought it was... You're right. I think he cites the Fermi theory that says the best evidence that we haven't been contacted by aliens is that once people discover nuclear power, civilizations tend to destroy themselves. But the countless post-apocalyptic and apocalyptic works of fiction that I enjoy consuming all basically point to something that hasn't actually happened. It could happen. It's right in the tip of our imagination all the time, but the fact that he also cites the fact that Black Americans adopted the slaveholders' religion, and not only adopted it, produced some of the greatest heroes of the faith, and able to use the same Christianity sort of to survive and then to overcome their captors. So I don't know. There's lots of. I think it's good to have just a perspective check on the reality of death. It can also be good to have a perspective check on the reality of life and how unlikely that is, and that in fact maybe God's hand is at work beyond just the hidden God, which I affirm. But you know what I mean. The excessively modest view.
Yeah.
Well,
Arch.
Dave, that reminds me of a couple things. I think in one of your dad's books, he talks about how his doctoral supervisor, when he was in Germany, once accused him of being a sin pessimist rather than a grace optimist. And your dad's commentary is, that was a dark day over there. But I think that's what this article is pointing us to, right? There's a temptation to become a sin pessimist, but he's asking us to be a little bit more grace optimists, you know. And I like this perspective too, because I feel like so often what Christians do with history is they either try to justify Christians, or they try to help God out, or that, you know, we need to do these things. You know, the temple must be rebuilt in order for Jesus to come back. Or they try to figure out when the end times are coming, which Jesus says, about that day and hour, nobody knows, not even the angels in heaven, not even the Son, but only the Father. And if Jesus doesn't know, we're probably not going to figure it out. But I like the way he's looking at history and saying, it was sort of eyes of faith, right? And saying, yeah, maybe we got lucky. And maybe there's actually someone looking out for us, which is something that I think we do individually all the time, right? As an individual, I always look back, and I look back to my own life, and especially times that were hard and when I didn't know what God was doing or what he was up to or where he was. And sometimes by the grace of God, you can look back and say, oh, okay. I sort of see maybe that's what he was doing. Maybe he was with me. Maybe he was carrying me. And this is doing that in a little more collective manner, which is also deeply biblical, right? That when in the Old Testament, right, when the Jews are remembering, they're not just remembering their own life, they're remembering the history of their people. And when they're praying, they're not just praying for themselves, but for their nation, right? And they're looking forward to a time, it might be generations in the future, when God will show up and deliver his people, even if he doesn't necessarily deliver them individually in the present. So yeah, it feels kind of counterintuitive, but it also feels kind of right and hopeful, which I like.
Yeah,
Sarah.
I mean, I think we really speaking of leaning into things, we really lean into like collective shoulds, especially in sort of mainline Protestant Christianity. Like, we all should care about this cause as Christians, and we all should do this thing as Christians. And I do think it's like a whole different, dare I say, more restful perspective to be like, God is actually taking care of us. Like, God loves us very much. And that love doesn't look the way that we think it should. But we are not God, thank God. And so this is how it looks. This is how we are being taken care of.
Yes.
I mean, it's why I as much as I sort of loathed writing spiritual autobiographies in seminary, I kind of wish everyone had to do them. Because you do really see the hand of God in so many ways in your life. You know, you see the things that God's preparing you for, and you know, who knows what God is preparing us for collectively in these conversations we're having about nuclear war. And who knows, maybe we will be spared, maybe we won't be. But I mean, I can tell you this, like in our household, because the kids will hear the news or whatever, and our daughter the other day was like, and she doesn't even know, of course, what like nuclear weapons are, but she's like, do you think that Russia's going to send a nuclear weapon to the United States? And we both said no, because, and like we both said it. And then later I was like, I mean, if they do, she won't know. We'll just all be dead. And Josh was like, yep. You know, it's like,
come
why
here,
would
honey.
we
Let's
worry
play
the
a little game
7-year-old?
while we wait for the bombs to fall. Let's all be together. And
yeah. I mean, it's just like, praise God. We've been spared for this long, and also praise God for, you know, for a community that even for, you know, 21 glorious seconds or whatever it was, we all cared about a people outside of ourselves in a hopeful,
I mean,
way,
I'm sitting
right?
here feeling gratitude in a way that is, you don't want it to come at the cost of these terrible things, but in fact, if anything, what David Clay's piece is saying is that like it could come at a lot more of a cost. You know, it's
it drives me crazy though, Dave, and I know it's just gotten worse when people say like, well, I wish we could do this without the suffering. Like, I wish we could have communal joy without the suffering. I wish we could, you know, and it's like, that's the only way
no
it
other
works.
way. Yeah.
Period. That's literally the only way it works.
It's not joy.
Otherwise, it's false.
Not actual. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's what is the Bob Dylan in Not Dark Yet, which I have a quote now that someone gave me, that behind every beautiful thing, there's been some kind of pain. And I think that's
totally. Every beautiful hymn you love has a story behind it.
Oh my gosh, RJ. Yes.
Well, you two, it's been great to be with you. One thing we forgot to mention is that the New York City Conference is a month away, or a little over a month away.
Wow.
definitely, it's a great crowd shaping up here. But please do, if you're planning to come, buy your tickets, your entry tickets soon, because we're filling up, and we cannot wait to see you. Hope you can come. But the two of you, we'll talk to you in a couple of weeks.
Yep.
If the bombs don't fall.
We won't know if they do.
And if they do, I'll see you in heaven.
Yeah,
All right,
exactly.
you two. You're the best. Bye. Thank you for listening. Remember, you can find us on the web at www.mbird.com. And we'd always love to hear from you at info@mbird.com. Audio production for the Mockingcast is provided by TJ Hester. And if you like what you've heard, please drop over to iTunes and leave us a rating or review. Until next time.
Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord.